This, my friends, is the BSA Gold Star, a beautiful looking retro motorcycle at a decent price too, and so you may well be considering one. Thing is though, it's been on the market already for a couple of years now, and so why would we revisit it?
Well, when I first actually rode it, it was before it had properly come out. So not being approved for use on the public road, we actually got to test it at Millbrook Proving Grounds, which is a private vehicle testing facility. So that's why I wanted to take another stab at this one, to find out what it's really like in the real world and on some of my favourite roads where I test all of the other bikes.
So in this video, we'll go through everything that I've learnt about it, both good and bad, to find out if it's still worth a look in 2025. But before we get underway, a massive thanks to DeleteMe for supporting the channel and making free-to-view videos like this one possible with their sponsorship.
Now look, if you've ever been concerned at all about the privacy of your personal details online, then I'd thoroughly recommend checking out DeleteMe, who specialise in finding it and getting it removed. You see, unfortunately, it's relatively common nowadays for things like your name, address, age, phone number, email address to be gathered and shared online, and there are even services called data brokers who make a business out of getting hold of it and selling it on to third parties. That means you could then be open to scams, phishing attacks, dodgy marketing, and in more extreme cases, things like identity theft and stalking. But that's, like I say, where DeleteMe comes in. Their team of experts takes the details that you put in, scours the internet to find them, and then make sure they get as many of them as possible removed. Then, after you've run your initial report, which is a big relief in its own right, well, it actually ticks away in the background and runs a report at regular intervals. So it's checking for your details year round, and if they do pop up, they'll get them removed. Now, I've been using it since we started partnering with them, and I've got to say it's a huge peace of mind to know that it's running in the background and taking care of that side of things. And so do check out the link down in the description below to find out more, or just type in joindeleteme.com/motobob and use the code motobob at the checkout to get 20% off one of their consumer plans. So once again, a massive thanks to DeleteMe for their support. And with that, onto the bike. So let's kick off with some of the good stuff about the Gold Star, of which there's plenty, but I think the primary reason to go and buy one of these is the way it looks. I think they've done a fantastic job of the styling, and I think it puts it among some of the best looking bikes on the retro market. I mean, the main thing is the paint job on this particular bike, with the chrome panels on the side of the tank, the metallic silver finish, and then some of the pinstriping to just give it a bit of detail, and it even continues through to the rear mudguard, which makes it look complete. Then you've got some of the other typical styling cues for bikes of this genre, so the oversized 18-inch front wheel, the spoked rims, the round headlight up front, the twin clocks in the cockpit. I like the way that they've tucked the catalyzer and radiator away quite neatly, in a similar way, I suppose, to what Triumph have done with the Bonnevilles. And then some nice details through the back of the bike, like the stitching on the bench seat and the little Gold Star logos on the side panels there. So if you're looking for a retro that's fairly authentic in its looks and also on that sort of 60s or 70s end of the spectrum, then I think, like I say, this is going to be one of the main reasons to look at the Gold Star. I will say though, one of the other reasons you should definitely consider this bike is the engine, with a big 650cc single cylinder. That makes it unlike anything else in this sort of middleweight 650 plus part of the retro market. Because if you think of the Enfield Interceptor or the Triumph T100 or the Kawasaki Z650 RS or the Moto Guzzi V7 or the Yamaha XSR or the Ducati Scrambler, well, yeah, they're all twins and there's not another single cylinder bike. I think for some people that's going to give it a really nostalgic feeling, but also for someone like myself who, you know, isn't old enough to have properly ridden BSAs of the past, well, it is still a really pleasant engine and there's plenty good about it beyond it just being a single. There's 45 horsepower peak and 55 Nm of peak torque, so there is enough shove to get a reasonable clip-on if you're happy just wafting through the countryside. And it does it with this satisfying soundtrack, which is of course, I think, enhanced by being a single, but also they've tuned a fairly pleasant note out of the exhaust system. It's got enough depth to it to sound meaty, and then also I really do like the fact that this engine, despite being a single, which you might expect to be a bit buzzy, is actually really nicely balanced and quite smooth, so it does feel comfortable and quite refined. The gearbox as well I would also call refined. It feels smooth, it feels reassuringly mechanical but not in a clunky way, and also I think they've got the throttle response dialed in quite nicely as well. It's smooth and predictable and there's no choppiness to it. So while it, probably isn't going to knock your socks off, and if you want something really fast you might want to look elsewhere, and also whilst singles might be an acquired taste, I'd still say this is the other major strong point of this particular bike. On top of that, I think I'd also rate it pretty highly for comfort as well. I think it's a typical upright naked riding position, but that makes it feel quite versatile and also sustainable for decent stints in the saddle. Now they have made it fairly accessible in the seat height at 780mm, so for someone of my height at 5'9" or 175 centimeters, it's a really easy reach to the floor at either side, so I can easily flat foot it. And then you've got plenty of space down to the pegs, so it doesn't feel particularly cramped, and really upright bars that keep your back upright too. So definitely comfort for me is another plus on this bike. And I'd also say, the suspension's set up to be fairly cushy and comfortable too. And so that gives it a perhaps slightly bouncy ride if you start to push it too hard. But if you ride it how it's meant to be ridden, which is at a more moderate pace, I would argue, then it's actually probably a good thing, because it does give it that cushiness which makes it pleasant to ride even if the road surfaces are a little less than perfect. In fact, generally I think it's fair to say that it's a nice easy bike to ride, which is partly aided by the fact that it isn't particularly hefty. It's 213 kilograms curb, and so comparable with some of the other bikes in this part of the market, and I think absolutely acceptable. Like I say, it is slung fairly low, and so it never really feels unmanageable, and it steers quite lightly. It's easy to get on with at lower speeds, and so definitely one that's pleasant to ride if you're more experienced, but also probably quite appealing to newer riders as well. Braking with the single disc up front with the Brembo caliper is enough if you're not going crazy. Same for the tyres as well. These Pirelli Phantoms give it the retro look, and they're more than good enough if you are just riding at a steady pace. And so it's only really when you start to push it beyond what it was designed for that it does start to get a bit flustered, but otherwise, it's a very easy bike to get on with, and I think that makes it quite appealing. And I think you have to view that all as well, the good looks, the good engine, the comfortable ergonomics, the easy handling, within the context of the price, which I think is really very good. You're looking at about $5,500 now for the base models, plus on the road fees, but it should still come in well under $6,000. And so really, when you look at everything you get in for that sort of money, I don't think you can realistically complain. But look, no bike's perfect, and so here are some of the little drawbacks about this bike, or considerations at least, that I think you should be aware of if you are thinking about buying one. The first thing, as I've said, is the performance and how it kind of behaves if you really do start to push it hard. It's just not quite up there with some of the other retros on the market, like the Triumph Speed 900 or the Yamaha XSR 700. It's down on power at about 45 horses, and so it doesn't accelerate particularly briskly, especially if you're already traveling at 40 or 50. And if you do start barreling into corners, you will start to wish that you had a bit more bite from the brakes or a bit more composure from the suspension. Thing is though, I would say those are the bikes that I've just mentioned, and stuff like the Ducati Scrambler, whilst they are better in terms of the riding dynamics, you're looking at a significant increase in costs. And if you compare this bike to something that is comparable in terms of price, like the Enfield Interceptor 650, Well, they are much more similar, and I think it stands up against it fairly well. Perhaps another thing to point out as well is the cockpit, which has some positives to it, I would say, in the fact that they've got the twin clocks and the fact that they go in reverse to most of the bikes, which is a nod to previous BSA models. But I do think that makes them a little tricky to read at a glance, as does the relatively modest font size and also the angle of these particular clocks, which seems to be flatter than my Bonneville, for example. Then some of the status lights are set into another round display in the middle, which is on the top of the headlight, and so that's again a little tricky to spot when you're just glancing down quickly. And so I do think it is a case of form over function, because while it does look pretty cool when it's sat there on the side stand, they're just not that easy to spot when you're going at speed. Also, the switchgear, I think I remember saying this in my previous review of this bike when we had it at the proving grounds, they're just not necessarily in keeping with the aesthetic of the rest of the bike. I know they've probably had to borrow or buy in some components to hit a certain price point, but if you look at the switchgear on an Enfield, for example, well, yeah, it does have some modern functionality and it is plasticky and feels kind of modern, but they have themed the look, so it does feel congruous with the overall aesthetic, whereas that isn't the case necessarily here. I think those are fairly minor gripes though. You probably know it's not going to be a sports bike in terms of the handling, and also the switchgear, you can probably make your peace with it given the price and also some of the other selling points. So definitely take a look at this one if you like your retros with a bit more of a classic style to them, but I still think it's the big single that gives it some real personality, some real soul, and makes some of those other shortcomings really quite easy to overlook. If you're looking for a single, then this is pretty much your only option, unless you go down to like the 350 Enfields, but for me personally, they just feel quite a bit too slow. They're about half the horsepower of this bike. That said, just because it's the only big single doesn't mean they've been complacent about that fact. It's a really nice engine in its own right, and I'd say if you're a single fan, or if you're not and you're just looking for a bike with a bit of a difference, then this is definitely at least worth taking for a demo.
As always though, I'd love to know what you think of the bike, so do let me know down in the comments below, and I'll leave my reviews of some of the competition on the screen now in a playlist so you can check those out too. A massive thanks again to DeleteMe for their support. You can find out more about them through the link in the description below, along with that code for 20% off. Do hit subscribe for more of the latest motorcycle news and reviews right here on MOTOBOB. A massive thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.